So, for those of us who have done React, I think we can agree that we do like it, right? And for really good reason. You have the component architecture, which lets you split your UI into smaller pieces that you can then connect. Right? You have the one-way data flow, so instead of traditional MVC where you wonder did the view change the model or the model change the view, you just have like a single centralized place where your state is put, or even a whole, for your whole application with a Redux store, it's in one place and that state gets passed down to those components. And then your components can dispatch actions that intend some kind of state change. And everything flows one way and it's easier to identify. And also, with these patterns and through others, you can write really declarative user interfaces. And now, even with hooks, you can express a whole React application in terms of functions, which is a really powerful concept. So we do like React, but it's not perfect. And so one of the biggest problems is that React's API until 16.8 did not support the reuse and the sharing of component logic. So for example, let's say you have a component that sets up a resource like a timer, or it makes an HTTP call, or it's going to subscribe to something, right? In component did mount, it may set up that subscription, and on unmount, it will clean everything up, and then maybe on component did update, it will change the subscription, refresh the subscription. In order to share that functionality across your application, you had to use abstractions like higher order components or render props. And they're great tools. They're based on solid principles, but they come with some weird trade-offs. And so the first pattern that we used to share component logic was higher order components. So you can see here you have a component that displays whatever. And this is a higher order component. This is a function that is going to take a component as an input, and it's going to output a new component that has some additional functionality or data. So for example, let's say, I don't know, this is just a component that displayed some piece of UI, and now this is a function that if you put in a component, you'll get out a component that knows how to read from some data source, set up and clean up some timer, or work with some subscription. This is the pattern for sharing component logic. And it's really cool because you just have this function sitting in one place, and any component that ever needs that functionality in your application can just pass through it once as an input to a function, and then you get this result. And this is great. This is also known as the decorator pattern in other languages. Yes, yes.
I was reading about that like last week.
Yeah, decorators are higher order functions. So you'd use them with a class probably, right?
Yeah, well, I've seen the example with a class where like a
Yeah.
class was using the interface in order to add extra functionality on the fly at runtime.
Yeah, and you're probably using that at symbol, right? The at symbol, like at logger, at something,
Oh,
right? Yeah, and so that's actually a syntactic sugar. Basically, it's calling that with your class, and then now your class has that capabilities, right? And you can stack these higher order functions. You can stack decorators, right? You can do at this, at that, at that. So it's a really good pattern. But when you're doing this in the user interface, something weird happens. This is the React developer tools. And this is a screenshot of a component that took the pattern way too far. So over here, probably, I don't even know. I think it's like around here. This was the original component. And so someone said, hey, I'm going to abstract all the things, and I'm going to make harder components out of everything. And if you keep wrapping, this is what you end up getting. Yeah. I actually had a similar case like this at my job. About last year, I wrote an internal application. And the UI that I was inspecting was really simple. It's just a form with like some text boxes, check boxes, a button, a little bit of information. And if you inspected it, you would get an output like this because I was using higher order functions. I was going crazy with them. I was like, oh, I can do it for lifecycle methods. I can do it for state. I can do it for action handlers. And then if you want to connect to Redux and Redux form, those are also decorators. So that all contributes to this tree. And so sometimes it can just feel like a joke. I'm going to be explaining this with memes, so I really hope they resonate. So that's one pattern, higher order components. It's awesome. It's based on solid principles, but it comes with that trade-off.
Question,
Yes, go ahead.
That's the second time you use that phrase. It's based on solid principles. You mean mean like literally solid, single responsibility, open, close?
No, solid is in like rock solid principles.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to distinguish it because.
Yeah.
Right. That's
SOLID.
another thing I've been learning about. So I'm like, wait, these buzzwords are like.
Gotcha. Okay. It's based off time-tested principles.
Okay,
There you go. Okay. And so that's one way to share component logic, harder components. Another one is called render props. And so instead of wrapping your thing in a function or like wrapping it in a decorator, you import whatever has that functionality, and as a child to that component, you create a function. And that function has access to the data, has access to the state, has access to, you can see there's actions in here, whatever you want access to. And this is also a good tested pattern, but you can see the issue here. Instead of having nesting in your React DOM tree, you've now taken the nesting to your code. And so you still kind of end up in that same scenario where either your tree is hard to read or your code is hard to read. Okay? So like whether you pick harder components or render props, you end up with nesting everywhere. Because what this leads to is, so first off, these two abstractions, they are not, these two abstractions, they're not, like, they are officially supported in the sense that like the React documentation talks about them as patterns. Hey, here's a good way to share your logic. But they're not strictly part of the React API. And so because of that, it's harder to discover these patterns. And they do have trade-offs that make them tougher to understand. And so what that leads to a lot of times, and I've seen this in my own company, is they don't know about harder components, they don't know about decorators, they don't know about render props. And so they just put everything in some kind of super component that has, you know, all this power, can do everything. But it's impossible to unit test. Maybe you can integration test it. Might get an end-to-end test. And so you just end up, hey, I can't have any bad abstractions if I don't do abstraction, right? And that's the wrong attitude, because then you're just copy-pasting everywhere. So there has to be a better way. And also, last piece I want to talk about is classes in JavaScript. Okay? Disclaimer, I think classes are great. I don't have a problem with them. But I don't think JavaScript should have ever introduced them. And I have 4 reasons as to why. First off, they're actually prototypes. Okay? So classes, classes are classes are syntactic sugar for prototypes. And so when somebody new comes to JavaScript, you're actually hiding that information from them, when knowledge of prototypes can be very useful. Okay? Second is, especially with React components, if you forget to do this weird bind syntax in your constructor, then you can end up like this guy, where you go to run your application, and then your this variable points to undefined, and you end up with cannot read property state of undefined, or cannot read property whatever of undefined. And so, and this is just a nuance of JavaScript classes that you're not going to see anywhere else. And so having to remember that can, you know, waste time, and it's annoying. Also, really annoying lint rules and super props, having to worry about that. I've actually had plenty of cases at my company where we have, so you guys familiar with linting?
Yeah.
Linting? Linting is essentially a code quality check in the sense that did you forget any semicolons? Are you following the style guide? Did you indent like everybody else? Right? Did you make this a const when it should have been a let? Did you make it a let when it should have been a const? Stuff like that, like style guide stuff. If your build process incorporates linting as part of deploying code, if you miss a single lint rule, your whole build fails and you got to start again. And at our company specifically, we use Jenkins for building. And Jenkins has its own problems, and it takes a long time to start sometimes. And sometimes your build will fail. You try it again, it'll magically work. Like, that's the kind of beast we're dealing with. And so you add on top of that all these weird lint rules regarding classes to follow. You miss a single thing. Like, for example, you have rules. If you're not using the constructor, the linter screams at you to remove it. If you have class methods, they have to be in a certain order, according to the linter. And a lot of this is from the Airbnb style guide. If you're not using class methods or lifecycle hooks, then your class should be a render function because it's not doing anything besides rendering. So all this stuff, like, why do we have to deal with this? And then lastly, at my company especially, we have a lot of people who come from a non-JavaScript background. And they're coming to learn JavaScript and React. And so, for example, they know Java. or they knew Java, and they know classes properly, they're comfortable with their language, we say, okay, learn this new language, and by the way, replace your knowledge of classes with this incorrect implementation of classes, with classes in JavaScript. See, because if you know a class in Java, you know a class in Python, you know a class in C++, but you don't know a class in JavaScript, because they follow different rules. And so you end up like, I think the meme's name is Harold. He's like, I forgot Java, but it's okay, I know React now. So this idea of trading things, it'd be better if we can tell the Java people, hey, when you're doing Java, focus on classes, focus on methods, encapsulation, great. When you're doing JavaScript, you're doing just functions. And there is a way to do that, introducing hooks. So first off, what are hooks? They're functions, just functions. And they let you hook into, that's why they're called hooks, they let you hook into React's state and lifecycle hook capabilities without needing a class. And so now React has a primitive, it has a first-class API to support isolating and reusing stateful logic without needing confusing abstractions like hardware components or render props. And this is going to solve all the problems that we just covered. This means you're not going to have any more overly nested component trees. You're not going to have any more overly nested code. You're not going to have classes and all their weird lint rules. And now, hopefully, over time, your fear of abstraction, as you become more comfortable with hooks, is going to go away. Because now there's a way, if I want to isolate some state, I want to isolate some logic, I can just do that using hooks. Right? Because React was all about components as building blocks. Now with hooks, we can do logic as building blocks. So the equation has been completed. And so you can go from this sad-looking guy to this. Okay? Hooks were shipped in React 16.8, and they are backwards compatible. So for example, if you have an existing React application that's using classes and all that good stuff, that's fine. You can upgrade if you want to use hooks, and you can just start putting them in without breaking your existing code. So they're totally backwards compatible. If you want, or rather if you're starting a brand new project, then hooks are production ready. They're officially supported. They've been shipped. They're not alpha anymore. So I think any new project you start, if you just install React, by default you'll have hooks. So you can migrate at your own pace, or you can just start a new project and enjoy hooks right away. And with that said, it is time for the demo. So I made 2 projects here. One of them is really simple. It's just a counter application. So this one. Let me go here. Okay. How's the font? Can everyone see this okay? Good, good, good. Okay, good. So this is the class version of this. I'm going to call it an application. You just have your count starting off at 0. And then you can increment, it'll go up by 1. You can decrement, it'll go down by 1. That's all it does. Enterprise grade, right? So the code for this is pretty straightforward using a class. Since I want to keep some state, right? I want to track the number that you're manipulating. I want to have access to it and remember it. So I'm going to use local component state for that. And in order to do that, before hooks, you would have to create a class, and you would have to extend the React component class so that via inheritance, you get access to state. Okay? And down here, I have a couple of methods. So when you click this, I'm going to call this method, that all it's going to do is it's going to change the state incrementing by 1. Then the decrement method, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm just going to decrement by 1. And then since these are class methods, you have to make sure that you bind them in the constructor. This is one of those rules I was talking about that's just like, you're not going to see this anywhere else. And in the render, here's the HTML that we return. So here's a button. When you click it, you're going to do increment. And when you click the decrement button, you're going to decrement. And that's all this is. Now I'm going to show you, first off, questions on this? I know you two are new to React. But generally, does this kind of make sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Okay, awesome. So here's the hooks version now. before I move on, class version has about 45 lines of code. Hooks version has about half that much. And this is something that I've experienced a lot when migrating from classes to hooks. You end up with about half the code. Yeah, that's like at least 35, 40%. It gets reduced, which is awesome. And you have the exact same logic. And I'm going to import the hooks version here. So instead of exporting class, I'm going to export default hooks version. And now you can see this is the hooks version. And it works exactly the same. Boom. Boom. Okay? So let's dive into the hooks version a little bit. Instead of using a class, instead of being tightly coupled to this parent in order to access state and methods and whatnot, React has a hook that just lets you use some state. It's a function that takes a parameter. The parameter is, what do you want your initial value to be? That's it. So for the counter, I'll refresh here. I want it to start off at 0. So I'm going to call useState. I'm going to say, give me 0 to begin. And what you get back is what's called a tuple, or basically an array with 2 items in it. And I'm going to pull out 2 values from the array. The first value in that array is your stateful value. So this is the count. This will change over time. Like right now it's 0. If I click this, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So this is the value that changes over time. And the second element you get back from useState is a setter for that value. So this is how you change it in your application. And then instead of class methods to increment and decrement, I make just plain old functions. So increment is a function that's going to call setCount with the current count plus 1. Decrement is going to do the opposite. It's going to call setCount with the count minus 1. And the HTML I'm returning is exactly the same as the class version. And so really all that's changed is here. Can I get some help from the audience here? Can you guys help me create a reset button? I want to put a button here that says reset, and it'll set the count back down to 0. Anybody want to help me walk through this? I'll add the button. That's the easy part. Okay. The function's probably going to be called reset, right?
Yeah.
All right. Our UI is broken right now, so let's fix it. Okay.
So apply the increment, decrement const,
Mhm.
right? Do const reset.
Const reset.
Equals
Set counts it, yeah.
Yes. Set count 0. And now, boom. Yep. If we wanted to, be a bit more dry, as in like don't repeat yourself, we can probably do this. Const initial count equals 0, and then boom, boom, initial count. Now it's, can't mess with us now. Okay. If you wanted to implement this in the class version, I can show you real quick. First off, you're not declaring a variable. This has to be on the class, so the rest of the class can access it. So this dot initial count equals 0. We can say this dot initial count. Make sure to bind the method. So we do reset down here. Create the method. Reset. The count goes back to this dot initial count. And here is your, here's your button. Right, and that's how you would get it done in the class version. So you see the hooks version took, it's half the code and it took half the time to actually write. Okay, so questions so far? Classes, yes, go ahead.
So will this hooks replace the class every case, or you don't need the class at all?
In 99.9% of cases. There is one exception that I've seen so far. This happened at work. So the latest app I'm using, it's using hooks. And there's one component or one type of use case that they don't have a hook for it yet, so I have to use a class. It's specifically, in React, it's called an error boundary. It's essentially try-catch for components. So try to load it. If it doesn't work, show some UI as a fallback. That's try-catch, right? So for error boundaries, they don't have hooks for that yet. I don't know when it'll be out, so I'm just using a class for now. But besides that, if you want to use some state, If you want to, like on initialization, you want to make a call, make a subscription, you want to clean up when the component in the destructor, any logic like that, they have hooks for that.
Do you know if that error boundary thing is going to be made, or you don't even know if they're planning to write a hook for it?
I would assume so, because why not? Unless there's something that I am unaware of, like regarding implementation here. But I would suspect at some point they'll have a hook for it.
So I said you are using like pure JavaScript. So where the hooks, where is, I mean, there is no like syntax or something like and or API. So how is it different from like plain JavaScript?
How is this different from plain JavaScript?
Where is the hooks? Because it's just JavaScript, right?
Yeah, under the hood, it's always all just JavaScript.
So it's like a principle, right? Kind of thing that okay, instead of using this, we are going to write stuff like that. I mean, it's like a principle. It's not like a new syntax or API, right?
It is a new API in terms of the code, but the principles that hooks are based on, if I'm not mistaken, they're based off what's called, and I don't know much about this, it's just stuff I've seen online, they're based off what's called, I think, algebraic effects.
I see.
And this is more like in the, I don't even want to say category theory because I'm not sure, but this is more like, it's definitely a CS principle that's been around way before hooks ever came out. And that's usually the case, right? Like a lot of this new stuff that comes out, it's not actually new. It's just some principle probably from 50 years ago that they put in a new wrapping.
Maybe worked it so that it works better.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like we've had the concept of artificial intelligence for at least decades, right? But now we're seeing this emergence of it because the tech has finally caught up. So hooks are no different.
The hook is like happening in the use state method or something? What is the hook?
Use state is the hook.
Use state
Is the hook, yes. Because before what you had to do is in order to get access, like to hook into state management for a component and lifecycle logic, like constructor, destructor type stuff, for a component, you had to use a class, the React component class, which came with the library. So that component class, it had knowledge and it had access to state and life cycles and all that. So in order to get it, you had to do inheritance. Now you can directly hook into state and life cycles without needing a class. That's the big difference here. Good?
Yeah.
Cool. Yes, go ahead.
So, first of all, the count and set count
Yeah.
could be.
I'll go ahead and move this over so you
named
can see.
whatever you want, right? And the set count is, you're calling it set count because you use count as the.
Yes.
Right.
It's just to make it easier on people. You can instead do this. So this is just an array, right? This syntax.
Structure in the array, right?
Exactly, yeah. It's a fancy ES6 destructuring. So I haven't done it in forever, but I think what is it? So const, like, I don't know, my state, I'll call it. I don't even know what to call it. My hook state equals react.useState. Okay, so these lines are identical. And then const count equals my hook state 0. And set count equals my hook state 1. And I think this will still just work. So you see, yeah, this is a shorthand for all of this. Does that make sense to everyone? Because this destructuring syntax is awesome. Because you can jump into an array, pick out whatever elements you want, and assign them to a variable all in one line. So that's really nice. And I think the reason why the React team decided to expose this hook state in terms of a tuple is because, like, let's say they returned an object, you would have to use whatever name they used, right? Because an object has keys, right? An array, you can call the indices whatever you want. So that's just part of API convenience, I believe. Questions on that?
So
Yeah.
the second thing in the array, in this case, set count, is that comparable to the old this.set state?
Pretty much. It follows similar rules. Although I don't know if you can return a function that updates state. I think it has to be React.setState action of a number. Yeah, I think you just pass in the value to this thing. So it's honestly, I think it's a simplified version of setState.
Okay.
Other questions? Okay. So hopefully this makes sense. We are going to jump to a more complicated but realistic and real-world example here. So I'm going to go to a new route, and I think this thing's been running since we started the presentation in memory. I forgot the name of the route. The route is /uploads. Okay, so if we go to /uploads, okay. So this is, in my work example, it was slightly more contextual, but basically the idea here is you have, oh, I need to up this. All right. You have basically a list of file uploads, and this is all a mock backend that I set up, but you have a list of file uploads. It's like every 5 seconds a new one gets added to the batch. And they all finish at different times. You see this one's 60%, this one's already done, this one's 80%, and you see how they finish at different speeds and stuff, right? And they come in and it's all real time and everything's updating in real time. I think this is a lot more practical in terms of an example, and I want to show the difference between using classes and using hooks in this one. So, questions on this UI, because I'm going to have to minimize it just a little bit to show the code properly. You have, like, this is your list of job IDs, and you click on one to see the current one, and you get its status. And if you click a new one, we forget about this one, and we move to the next one. So conceptually, that makes sense? Okay, good. Let's go to the hooks boyo. No, sorry, the class first. Okay, cool. Let's close the others. Okay, so in order to create this UI with all these jobs and these details, you needed a few things. So obviously we're maintaining state. We have some stateful logic going on. So we needed a class. And we needed the component class to access this .state and whatnot. So in our state, we have the list of upload IDs. That's all these guys. 123, 124, 126, 129, and it updates over time. The current ID that we're focusing on, so you can see that when you click on one, it gets highlighted, right? This is the current upload ID. So currently it's 123, now it's 126, 127, and we get the details for each one. And a given uploads details is also stored in state. So 3 pieces. And this is what our application is going to revolve around. So I just gave it some initial values, empty array, null, empty object. All the methods for changing your state details, you have to bind them. Here are the methods. So for set upload IDs, these are all straightforward, right? You just get some IDs when you fetch them initially, and they get passed into here, and now we're keeping track of them. Same thing with the current one, and same thing with the upload one. Questions on these methods? I'm hoping they're pretty straightforward. Okay, good. All right, so here is our first lifecycle hook. This is component did mount. This is essentially, it runs like, I think, after the constructor. So anytime you want to perform some initialization work, you want to fetch some data, you want to subscribe to something, whatever, you would put it inside this method. Okay, this is, at this point, React guarantees that the browser, like the DOM, is ready to be read from, and if you want to make any manipulations. Yes, go ahead.
It goes after the first render.
After the first render.
Because it mounted, right?
Right.
It mounted, then it does that.
So it has to be after the first render. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So this is a guaranteed safe spot to do any initialization work. Component did mount. Okay. So what we do inside a component did mount is we are going to go to our upload API. Okay. Don't worry too much about the API's details. I just made this as a mock just to get this good example. But we're going to call its method to get all the upload IDs. So I want to get this list of 123, 124, 125, 126. I'm going to call subscribe. Again, don't worry, I'm waving my hands here. Magic. Don't worry about it. And then once we get the upload IDs, I'm going to call the method to store them in our component state. That's it. And the subscribe, all it does, and this is not hooks specific, all this does is anytime I get a new ID, give me the latest list so I can update it in state. That's how this updates in real time. So 146, if you give it 3, 2, 1, hopefully 147. pops out. So that's the idea behind this API. It's real time. Okay. Now component did update. This is another lifecycle hook. And so what this does is anytime there's a change in your component state, I want to know about it because I want to do some kind of effect on the user interface. So our logic here is we're saying we need a safety check. If we don't have a current upload ID, then just return, leave. I don't want to do anything. If we do have a current upload ID and the previous one we had is different from the current one, meaning somebody clicked this, right? So when you click on 144, previously it was 145. Now it's 144. They're not the same. So if they're not the same, I want to unsubscribe from the previous subscription. I want to forget about 145, and I want to focus on 144. And once I get the upload details for 144, I'm going to subscribe, and I'm going to put that in my state. So this is how you get this functionality. I think if I put a console log in here, it'll make it really. So console dot log previous is going to be this dot. Oh, sorry. Previous state dot upload. Oh, sorry, current upload ID. And we'll also console dot log the current one. So if we can get in here. Previous 124. Let's put the console logs in here. Okay, so you see how previously we had no ID. I click on 127, and that's the current one now. Now if I click on 126, the previous one is 127. The current one is 126. Does that make sense? So when you click on one, I do a little diff. And I say, if the previous one and the current one are not the same, unsubscribe from the previous, I don't need it anymore, and focus on the current one. That's how you get this functionality. Okay? And a component will unmount. This is essentially like the destructor of the class, where when you're about to leave the page, you're going to close the page, you're just going to get rid of the component. This is any cleanup logic you want to put in. So to avoid memory leaks, I say that when the component is about to unmount, I want to unsubscribe from this list, and I want to unsubscribe from these details. So essentially, clean up and we are done. And then all I do in here is, in the HTML that I'm sending back, is for every upload ID we have, I create a list item. So that's this list over here. And then I have just a component that called upload details, and I feed the details into it, and it renders me this pretty screen. Questions on the class one? Questions on how we update them? Okay. So in my opinion, this could be drastically simplified by using hooks. So I'm going to show you the hooks version now. Again, we're over 100 lines. The hooks version is about 50 or 60. Yeah, 63, 62 if you don't want to count the new line. And I'm going to import it here just to show you that they're exactly the same. So we're not going to export the class version. We're going to export the hooks version. And now you can see it still functions exactly the same. And now 126 just popped in. Here's all the details for 126 and all of its details. So in the class version, we kept track of 3 values, right? All the IDs, the current one, and all the details. So subsequently, in the hooks version, we need 3 use states. There's a different way to set this up, but for simplicity's sake, I just want to talk about use state. And so same initial values. Initially, we have just an empty list of upload IDs, so I put that here. We don't have a current one because the user hasn't selected one, right? It starts off as null. And we don't have any details, so we'll just make it an empty object, okay? Now, here comes the hook that is probably the most useful and the most frustrating to understand. And so I'm hoping today I can help break that barrier. This is called use effect. Use effect, depending on how you take advantage of it, replaces component did mount, component will unmount, and component did update all in one shot. What this does is this is a hook that takes two parameters. The first parameter is this that I'm highlighting. What is the effect that you want to do? Right? Because sometimes a component produces what's known as a side effect, an effect. Okay? And the side effect is anything that is apart from calculating some value. So for example, if you have a component that I give it 6 and it returns a label on the screen that says 6, that's just a pure component, it does nothing else. But let's say the component, I give it 6, it renders 6, and it makes an API request, that's an effect. That API request is a side effect. See? Because it has nothing to do with rendering to the DOM. So sometimes you want to perform side effects in your component, so React lets you do this with use effect. So your first parameter is what effect do you want to do. And so this is exactly the same as we had in component did mount. I say when the component comes into the DOM, I want to get all the upload IDs, subscribe to them, and have like a live list of the IDs that are in the system. Okay? And then from use effect, whatever function you return, this is considered cleanup logic. So you see how this replaces did mount and will unmount, boom, in one shot. So in the main body, here is your initialization work, and then here's your, I'll call it destructor work. Okay? And so this subscribe method, it returns a subscription. So I'm going to call unsubscribe whenever it's done. Okay? Now the second, can anybody tell me what this is? An empty array, yes. This is, can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, you know, I'll zoom in one more time. So, like I said, first parameter is the effect. The second parameter is a list of dependencies. What values does your hook depend on? And so what React does, React is really smart about this. Remember in the class version, in the component did update method, I said if my previous ID and my current ID are different, I want to unsubscribe and resubscribe, right? React takes care of that diffing work for me with use effect. So what it does with this list of dependencies, it looks at all the values inside. It says if any value changed from one render to another, I'm going to run the effect from the start again. Now, tell me, by that logic, whatever is inside that dependencies list, if there's a difference between the old and the new one, run the effect again. If I give nothing, if I give an empty list, how many times is this effect going to run?
Yeah. Well, once the first time.
Once.
Yeah.
But is it ever going to run again? Why?
Because you're telling it there's nothing to look for.
Exactly. And so an empty array is always going to be an empty array no matter how many times you diff them, right? And so this is how you can simulate component did mount. Okay? And it's not even a hack. This is how use effect works just out of the box. It says, oh, no values. Okay, so there's nothing to diff. That means I'm only ever going to run it once. And as a result, the cleanup logic is only going to run once. So all the IDs you need, you get them once, and when you leave once, you are going to clean them up. You're going to unsubscribe. Now, let's say, for example, you have a value that depends on something, right? Because we said in here, can I pop this? Oh, nice. Okay, yeah, this is easier to look at, right? Okay, good. So once we're going to fetch all the IDs. Great. And once we're going to clean up. But what about this? Every time I click a new one, I want to clean up the old details. I want to get the new details. So we're going to take advantage of use effects dependency system. So let me close this out. Okay. So here's the effect for getting the details of a given job. We still need the safety check from the class version. We say if there is no upload ID, don't do anything because there's nothing to check for. Then what we do inside the body of our effect is we're going to get the details for that ID, and we're going to subscribe so we can get the percentage in real time. And then same thing. We're going to return a cleanup function that is going to unsubscribe. And we want to do this anytime the current upload ID changes. See the difference of usage here. In the previous effect, I said I have no values to depend on. Do it once, clean up once. This one, I want to subscribe and unsubscribe for any time the upload ID changes. This part really needs to sink home. Is this making sense? Any questions, please? All right, awesome. Okay, and just like the class version, the HTML that we return is exactly the same, so there's really nothing to see here. When you click on one, I'm just going to change the upload ID, and in turn, that's going to fire this effect to subscribe, and when it runs again, we're going to unsubscribe and resubscribe. Okay, and that is my presentation.
The subscribe and unsubscribe, is that a JavaScript thing? I mean, it's all JavaScript, but I mean, is that like something that's built in JavaScript, or is that the method that's on that particular function that you're using? Code there?
Yeah, the subscribe method on the API, right?
Yeah, is that something that comes from the upload API, or is that just like a general JavaScript thing? Subscribe
I made that as part of the upload API,
okay.
only because I wanted something real time. So I had to use like this. Basically, you guys familiar with PubSub, publisher subscriber model, that design pattern? So like basically a publisher. Hey Odi, how are you? A publisher is a thing that sends out notifications to everyone who's subscribing to it. Honestly, it's just like YouTube or like an email list, right? So the YouTube channel is the publisher. When they upload a video, if you're on that, part of their notification squad, then you're going to get the message that they sent out. So this upload API is a publisher, and I'm going to subscribe to it, and anytime it gets new data, I'm going to consume that and make that part of, I'm going to render that to the screen. I'm going to do whatever I want with it. Did that answer your question? I feel like I went on a tangent there.
No.
Okay, okay, great. Yeah, this is a little bit of magic. After the presentation, I'm happy to dive into this with you. But I just want to make it clear that this has nothing to do with hooks. I just needed something. I just needed a real-time API. That's it. Okay. Any last questions before we wrap up? Awesome. Thank you so much. I really hope I was recording the entire time. Imagine I wasn't.